Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by CEI. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. The second half of the show today, we'll be talking with Jonathan Rauch, an American author and journalist and a contributing editor for the National Journal and The Atlantic. Jonathan is also a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington. He's perhaps best known as an outspoken advocate of free speech and an enemy of campus speech codes. Jonathan, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
You're celebrating the 20th anniversary of your best-selling book, Kindly Inquisitors, with an updated edition. Let me read a quote from that book to start our conversation. A liberal society stands on the proposition that we should all take seriously the idea that we might be wrong. This means we must place no one, including ourselves, beyond the reach of criticism. It means that we must allow people to err, even when that error offends and upsets, as it often will. Jonathan, let me start with a trick question. Could you be wrong about this? Is it really beyond debate that there is no evil speech that the public should be protected from?
It is not beyond the debate that there's no evil speech that the public should be protected from. And in fact, in the new edition of my book on this, one of the things I try to do is come to grips with a newer and in many ways more sophisticated, interesting argument for restrictions on speech. Mm-hmm. So this is a debate that is not going to end anytime soon.
How does society decide what's beyond the pale, like cannibal advocacy?
Here's the trick to something that I call liberal science. If you'll let me sort of say a paragraph on this, maybe to set it up a little bit. Mm-hmm. So society has a system for creating and allocating wealth, and we call it capitalism. And we have a system for allocating and establishing, legitimizing power, and we call it democracy. And they both have in common that they're liberal systems, small l, meaning some would say kind of classical liberal. They're open-ended, they're depersonalized, and they're rule-based.
Market
so it
liberal,
doesn't matter who
right.
you are. You're
Free
buying, you're selling, you're voting, and you don't set the outcome in advance, and you don't particularly privilege certain people over anybody else. So we also have a system for making knowledge, deciding what's true and what isn't true, and it's science. But big, not just hard sciences like engineering and physics, but all the way out to journalism, our whole system of creating knowledge. And we do that by testing hypotheses socially. I say something, you think it's BS, you criticize it, you knock it down, more people get into the act at any given day. What remains after this storm of criticism is our knowledge, and it all depends on the freedom and the ability of individuals to put ideas out there, however bad and offensive those ideas might be, because some of them are going to turn out to be true. Mm-hmm. The idea that homosexuality is perfectly normal as a human variation was crazy and offensive and dangerous 50 years ago. Now we know it to be true, and I'm a gay man and married. And I have liberal science to thank for this. So now to your question. So what do you do about people who are, let's say, just offensive jerks? You know, you're neo-Nazis. You can, pick an example.
In other words, their ideas are not likely to catch on. They're just being jerks about it.
Either they're just being jerks, maybe because they want to be jerks, or they're fringe people who aren't serious. It turns out liberal science has an extremely effective way to deal with this. More effective, much more, I would argue, than trying to pass laws, which is we marginalize them. People look at these ideas and say, this is too screwy to even talk about.
Tinfoil hat.
Tinfoil hat, exactly. Or they look at it, and they all, they subject it to criticism, and it just falls down because it's ridiculous.
Let's take a case in point about liberal science and the lively debate subjecting scientific theories to intense scrutiny. What do you make of attempts by global warming advocates to declare the science settled and labeling critics as climate deniers?
Bill, people always do that in every debate because people think they're right.
I don't know that they always do that in every debate. This has been a very effective way to compare critics of climate models to Holocaust deniers. That doesn't happen when you're talking about other scientific theories.
You'd be surprised in my career how often it's happened that people say, you just can't say that. The trick isn't to stop people from trying to shut down the debate. That dogmatism, that intensity actually helps drive the debate forward by creating a more spirited kind of criticism. But the key isn't to stop them from claiming that they've settled a debate. It's to prevent any party from getting enough control over the system so that they can shut it down.
If they control the science funding mechanism.
As long as no one party is in a position to shut it down, you're fine. It's really not a problem.
But that's not the case here.
Well, that I don't know enough about to say. I know some of my free market friends say that the debate has not been able to be conducted fairly. I cannot vouch for that. And And in fact, if you look at the American public right now, public opinion has moved against the global warming idea. So these attempts to shut down debate,
It hasn't worked very well.
It doesn't seem to be very successful if that's what they're doing.
How should society balance the right to offend and the rights of the offended?
Well, I think of it more in terms of a rights plus responsibility arrangement.
Mm-hmm.
It's very easy, especially for my libertarian friends, to think of all this as a rights question. You have the right to free speech, to say whatever you want. And you do. That's the big part of this system. But it doesn't end there. If you want to be a good citizen in the system that creates knowledge, and if you want to be taken seriously in that system, you have not only a right to speak, but a responsibility to subject your opinions to critical testing by others.
Mm-hmm.
That means you never try to shut down anyone else who wants to check you, and you submit yourself to checking, and you take that process seriously.
How do you deal with the giving of offense? When you state your position, there are some people who will honestly be offended. How must you weigh that?
Well, as an individual, part of the responsibility to check means you're offended. It's going to happen. Actually, it's going to happen a lot. You suck it up. That's part of the checking process.
Okay.
We agree as part of the system to submit ourselves to that. We don't agree to like it, but we agree not to use central authorities to try to shut it down. As a society, how do you deal with it? One way people deal with it is by trying to set up, again, central authorities. They could be political, or they could be campus speech codes, or they could be various other means to try to decide where the line is between too offensive and not quite too offensive. Those systems turn out to work very, very poorly. Or you can say, well, the way we're going to deal with offensive speech and offensive ideas is as long as those people are subject to checking, they're very quickly not going to be taken seriously, because offending people turns out to be a very bad way to persuade them. And the way science works is at the end of the day, you have to persuade.
Mm-hmm.
You have to persuade a critical mass of people, of critics, that you're right. You do that all kinds of ways, by having better arguments, by conducting experiments in the hard science. But a lot of it just has to do in a discipline like history, for example, or opinion. The business you're in has a lot to do with, at the end of the day, being more reasonable, being someone who wins them over. And that's a much better way to handle it. You can't be offended, really, and offensive all the time in that game and win.
It's not clear that everybody wants to persuade. I think some people are just looking for self-affirmation. Certainly a lot of what I perceive as good business on right-wing radio is more about self-affirmation than it is about persuasion. How does that fit?
You know, I'm not crazy about it any more than you are, but it's absolutely nothing new. And kind of circling back, those people in the long run, they may have good short-term careers, but something I've learned over 30 years, public advocacy for some very unpopular ideas like gay marriage, is those people crash and burn. As I think you mentioned to me in a private conversation, you found that the staying power of those tactics, if you really want influence, are really not so good. And remember, outrageousness and offensiveness and even hate speech have a place in society. We don't like them, but they do get people riled up. And sometimes that does inspire people on the other side, or people with better arguments, to get involved. And I know that's happened in the gay movement.
People who might otherwise sit on the sidelines get pulled in.
That's right. So it's messy, sure, and some people have bad motives and some people have better motives. But should it ever be politeness, or should it be enforced politeness? No, absolutely not. There's a great historian and scholar of sociologists of science named David Hull, who once pointed out that if you look at what really goes on in science, it's not antiseptic at all, and that one of the great motivators in science, he said, is the desire to, quote, get that son of a bitch.
That's true. That's true. I mean, it drives careers, it drives funding. We're humans, and people bring their wellstream of motivation from many different sources, and sometimes getting mad is a source.
It's like capitalism, you know. It's the famous point is that the baker does not provide his loaf of bread out of benevolence necessarily. In capitalism, you have all kinds of motives. The trick is to pit these people against each other.
Let's just a case that just occurred, and this is the height of capitalism, which is a Super Bowl commercial. Coca-Cola ran an ad that apparently offended some people because America the Beautiful was sung in foreign languages. And then, of course, others were offended by those who were offended. So I got to ask you, as a free speech advocate, are you offended by those who were offended by those who were offended? And where does all that end?
Well, boy, we're in a hall of mirrors there, aren't
Yeah.
we? I should say I haven't seen it yet. I'm going to go hunt it down as soon as we're done. Sounds interesting. I think too many people are in the business of getting too offended too often. I think they forget that this is responsibilities as well as rights, and that we have a responsibility to be thick-skinned in an intellectual market and to understand people are going to say stuff. So I'm not a big fan of the offendedness Olympics. But that said, as long as no one's in a position to dictate to the whole system how much offendedness is enough, as long as it's just people arguing with each other within the social network of science, liberal science, about where the limits are, that's exactly what we should be doing. And that's how that system resolves that over time.
Let's go into microcultures where people do have the power to set speech rules, and that's the campus. Multiculturalism is now de rigueur on college campuses. There are speech codes. There are all sorts of behavioral rules that need to be comported with pretty serious repercussions for violators. What do you make of all that? Has that peaked, or is this just what we're going to have to get used to?
It's morphed. And to some extent, we're probably going to have to get used to it because it's really dug in. I first published Kindly Inquisitors in 1993, which was when the original political correctness movement was peaking, and there was a whole lot of talk about campus speech restrictions, and those restrictions were heavy-handed and ideological. You had people saying quite frontally that the First Amendment was a terrible idea, and that words that wound are the same as bullets, a doctrine which has implications for shutting down speech that have no boundaries, right? So in the last 20 years, I think the news is more good than bad. A lot of the ideological support for this has shriveled up and gone away. And so you really don't see people on college campuses anymore saying, we've got to rethink the whole free speech thing. That's a form of discrimination.
No, they've retreated. They've definitely
against
retreated.
minorities.
But there are still codes.
In fact, I have trouble even to find people to argue against on this. And that used to, believe me, not be a problem. So the new edition of my book comes out. Did I mention my book's out in the new edition?
That's why people go on the radio.
Fast forward 20 years is something that's rather different, which is the bureaucratization of speech codes on campus. Much less ideological, somewhat less partisan. But now speech codes are part of the furniture. They're run now by personnel offices and human resources departments and, deputy deans for non-discrimination and people like that.
It's part of where all that tuition goes.
Yeah, and most days, most of the time, it's not a big problem. But you know how bureaucracies are. Once they get started, they're very hard to stop. So now you've got this it's more like a background thrum than a big frontal noise. There's some very good organizations, one in particular, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, which I'm a fan of, which has done some very important work in actually publicly shaming and, if that fails, litigating against some of these speech codes. And that work will go on.
Well, public shaming has that wonderful connotation of you could take it or leave it. There's no coercion involved, and no one is going to be there with a set of handcuffs at the end of the day. Let's talk a moment about the poor stepsister of free speech, and that's freedom of association. Where does the right to engage in social, political, and even economic intercourse with fellow citizens of your choice impinge on the rights of those excluded?
Well, here we get into a related but quite different area of turf.
That's why I called it the poor stepsister.
Yeah, and that gets into issues like anti-discrimination law, for example. Can you require a business to do business with someone and thus associate with them? Can you regulate in some way who the Boy Scouts do and don't accept?
Well, let's take a perfect example. The baker who didn't want to make a wedding cake for a gay couple is now in deep legal trouble. How do you sort that out?
I think that here we get into a real area of social conflict where it gets harder to generalize. I am not someone who says that we should not have anti-discrimination laws, particularly as relates to race in America. But I've also been someone who, as a gay rights advocate and a gay marriage advocate, has been telling my side of things that it's probably counterproductive to try to be purists about anti-discrimination law and say, for example, that every baker in the country has to do business with us or we're going to take them to court. Because I think it's important in the long run to be able to have a country where we can live with each other. And I think the truth is that gay people should It's in our interest actually to back off to some extent and say, you know what, if there are Christians of good conscience
live and let live,
who don't want to do this business, and if there's another way to get the thing done such that I'm not excluded from society, and usually there are other bakers around, that's probably the better solution.
It's a lot more persuasive than drawing up battle lines, that's for sure. And let the culture go where it's going to go. I mean, I think the vectors have all been in a positive direction. Why do you want to screw that up?
The culture is going the right way. I would just ask my libertarian friends to remember that situations where you get effective boycotts of minority populations can happen. They did happen in this country. They are real. And we had to do some stuff in order to fix that, important, legitimate stuff. I don't think gay people are in that position today. I'm not sure that anyone is in that position today, thank goodness. But there is a place, I think, for stepping in.
My wife is a Lebanese immigrant, actually fled the civil war there. And when people disagree with each other in that part of the world, they tend to blow each other up. She grounds me constantly by reminding me, you might be aggravated now by people shouting at each other. There's no place better than this.
That's so important. We think of the country, rightly to some extent, as deeply polarized, and Congress is overly partisan and
compared
dysfunctional.
To what?
Well, compared to what is a pretty important question. And for all that, our society, our culture, is actually pretty good at figuring out accommodations and ways to live with each other.
Let me switch to one last subject, which is near and dear to my heart. I call it the impotence of reason. Anyone involved in public policy knows that facts and logic can often be completely upended by a well-crafted narrative. The best storyteller wins, not necessarily the best truth teller. Why is the left so much better at this than the right?
Well, first of all, it's not. Though my conservative friends all think it is. Believe me, my liberal friends all ask the same question. Why is the right so much better at framing issues? And then they write entire books around how we need to change our vocabulary. So I think the premise is actually wrong.
Okay.
I think both sides are pretty good at it, but I'd also challenge the premise on a different level, which is, yes, control of the narrative or having the better story is important in the short and medium run, but in the longer run, there is just no substitute for being right. People ask me, in fact, just today, for example, why did things change so dramatically on the gay marriage issue? You could argue it's control of the narrative, but no one really controlled that. And of course, for most of that time, it was overwhelmingly controlled by people who said, what a ridiculous idea. But Massachusetts legalized gay marriage. And the bad things, the horrible things that the opponents said would happen didn't. And after a while, it started becoming clear that the case against same-sex marriage was pretty much collapsing. So in the long run, being right really, really matters. And as I argue in the new afterword to my book, did I mention my book? What's most important for minorities is to have the opportunity to make our case and prove that we're right. I argue and believe that minorities are much better off in a society that protects offensive and hateful expression than they are in a society that protects them from hateful and offensive expression.
That's a pretty compelling argument. I mean, I spend more time worrying about economic arguments and economic fallacies that have been enshrined in public policy for decades and going on a century now, if you look at Keynesian pump priming and money printing. And I would challenge your view that being right matters, because the economic policies that are proven to be wrong time and time again, the good narrative, anytime there's a crisis, those policies come back.
Well, I'm not sure we want to get into economics, so I'll summarize by saying we're on very different sides on that issue. I'm a fan of the TARP and the stimulus programs and what the Fed did and a whole lot of other things which you're not.
Maybe we shouldn't
go there. We shouldn't go there.
Let's cordially agree to disagree.
Well, see, that's how this thing works. You and I don't have to agree on that, and in fact, we shouldn't. The genius of liberal science is that it's actually better for society when people don't agree than when they do.
Yeah.
Because that gives you the raw material for the competition of ideas, and that's how we figure out in the long run who's right.
Let's leave it at that. It's been delightful. Of course, I'll have to go out and buy the book, which you might have mentioned. We've been talking with Jonathan Rauch from the Brookings Institution, author of Kindly Inquisitors, The New Attacks on Free Thought, recently released in an expanded edition with a foreword by George Will. Jonathan, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you. It's fun to be here.
That wraps up this week's edition of Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by CEI. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Join us here same time every Saturday, and drop me a line at bill@realclearradio.org if you'd like to suggest a topic or guest.